It seems like an eternity has passed since the SLS core stage was sitting on the test stands at Stennis, so far away from Cape Canaveral and so far removed from the first launch of Artemis. It seemed like it was going to be an eternity before this could take place, especially since the first green run failed so miserably, and it wasn't because of an engine fault as was initially indicated, and I never believed that it was an engine fault simply because these RS-25s have proven to be so reliable on past shuttle missions that a fault seemed almost impossible. It wasn't. Then again, it wasn't a software failure either. It was a failure with additional equipment that had been added to the engines since the shuttle had used these particular engines in the past. However, I was soon to start getting hypnotized by the SLS project when this took place. Unbelievable. The rocket's still kicking, guys. It's still kicking. 8 minutes or 20 seconds. Unreal. What a fantastic success. I can't believe I'm talking this way about the SLS, but I am. Look at that. Just look at it. And so it began, the brief and unlikely love affair between myself and Boeing's behemoth, the SLS. I was starting to drink the Kool-Aid. I was starting to believe that this rocket was going to be the vehicle to take mankind back to the moon. That even though Starship was the best long-term solution for the human species as far as colonizing the solar system was concerned, SLS was the best short-term scenario, and I was growing ever more confident that SLS and Artemis 1 was going to launch by the end of 2021, or at least at the beginning of 2022. There were rumors circulating that there were other issues starting to come up, testing issues and other problems with the wet rehearsal, and as it's called, when they load the rocket up with fuel and simulate a launch without actually hitting the button, those sorts of things, that these processes would take a lot longer than NASA was indicating, and we wouldn't be seeing a launch of SLS until summer at the earliest. I dismissed these ideas. I didn't want to believe them simply because I had seen SLS perform in person, and it just seemed that NASA was starting to get back on track, and finally this thing was going to live up to its expectations. And then a few days ago, my hopes were dashed. My name is Jordan Wright. I was born in the same year that the human race took its first steps on the surface of another world, and then we promptly betrayed those people's legacy by never going back. But now, over half a century later, there's a new breed of pioneers that are seeking to finish what these people set out to do so long ago. But there is trouble as well. Corrupt contractors who are looking to take advantage of one of the most underfunded departments of the U.S. government and an unsustainable plan that is doomed to cancellation, as the Apollo project was. Something has to change. So it's time for commentators like me to stop being polite and start getting angry. So those of you who are familiar with my channel may have noticed that I tend to be very hard on Starliner. As a matter of fact, I have absolutely nothing good to say about it, and yet SLS has been relatively free of criticism for quite some time, even though it is mostly a Boeing product as well. Why have I been so inconsistent? Well, I must admit, part of me was really hoping that SLS wasn't going to fall victim to the same issues as Starliner, because that would mean that Artemis would be in danger of complete and utter failure. But aside from that, there's a lot of other companies involved in SLS, companies like ULA, Dynetics, and others that are integrated into the systems for SLS, including software, including the upper stage and other aspects of this project, that suggested to me that it wouldn't be as bad as Boeing's disaster, the Starliner, but that it does not seem to be the case. Quickly reviewing what went wrong with Starliner, as most of you know, the test flight took place almost 2 years ago now. In fact, I think it was over 2 years ago, when an unmanned Starliner was supposed to dock with the ISS and then return safely to Earth. Well, they got halfway there, or maybe a third of the way there. The Starliner went on the wrong course, engaged its boosters in the wrong direction. NASA tried to communicate with the spacecraft in order to correct this problem, failed to do so, so there were 2 glitches right off the bat. And then when the vehicle was re-entering after its failed attempt to dock with ISS, the service module and the crew module did not separate properly, putting the entire vehicle in danger. NASA officials commented that they almost lost the spacecraft twice during this test, and afterwards an in-depth investigation found more than 80 flaws, almost all of them software related, which had to be rectified. These theoretically were rectified, but of course, as we all know, they weren't. I mean, let's be honest here. Orbital Flight Test 2, or OFT2, didn't even get this far the second time around. Instead, there was a valve issue that still has not been firmly identified. Instead, there is a leading cause for this valve issue: that nitrogen tetroxide oxidizer permeated the Teflon seals in the valve, interacted with moisture on the other side. The nitric acid then corroded the valves and caused almost all of them to stick in the closed position. But here's the problem. We really don't know if that was the case. It has not been firmly established. So instead of tracking down the root cause, they are simply swapping out 2 modules, and they're going to put in the new Starliner module in place of the old one as they continue to work on the root cause of the problem. What that means is the next launch of Starliner will be done without a clear idea of what caused the failure of Orbital Flight Test 2. That's not a very reassuring thought. And if this unmanned test goes well, and by the way, the first one went well without any valve issues whatsoever, then human beings are going to go up on the next one, quite possibly without ever identifying the root cause of the failure of OFT2 in the first place. That is an unacceptable risk, and yet it's likely to happen assuming that the second unmanned flight test of Starliner goes well. This is a colossal disaster, something that certainly cannot begin to compare to the problems we're having with SLS, right? Right? I mean, all of the major issues with Artemis 1 seem to be behind us. As a matter of fact, as you can see here, they're hard at work on Artemis 2, building yet another SLS rocket for the first manned mission to the moon. This would presume that the first SLS doesn't really have any significant problems in front of it anymore, and it's ready for launch. And have a look at this test, a test that we are quite familiar with, watching all of these SpaceX fuel tank tests, testing SLS's fuel tanks to failure. I'm just doing this because I think it's kind of cool. There just appeared to be a lot of things to be optimistic about when it came to SLS. The RS-25 engines have been tested to full duration burns, actually beyond full duration, without any problems. On top of that, the solid rocket boosters have been tested to full duration burns without any problems. The Orion capsule had been tested into orbital flight and had re-entered, landing successfully in the ocean without any problems. Everything about this rocket seemed to be ready to go. The only thing that remained was stacking it and integrating all of the systems, and this is where Boeing simply seems to be falling down the same way that they fell down with the Starliner, because when it comes to software, Boeing just sucks. In a statement released on December 17th, NASA announced that SLS engineers had decided that they needed to replace a controller for engine number 4 in the core stage of SLS. One of 2 redundant channels in the controller failed to power up consistently during tests of the integrated vehicle at the Kennedy Space Center. Now keep in mind, this controller had functioned just fine during the green run, and now it's starting to have problems, and NASA of course admitted this. The controller did operate as expected during the test at Stennis, and an initial investigation of this controller has once again failed to identify the root cause of the problem. So what NASA is doing is replacing the engine controller, quote, returning the rocket to full functionality and redundancy while continuing to investigate and identify a root cause, unquote. And the consequences of this? Well, NASA was hoping to launch SLS between February 12th and February 27th. I had actually lined up hotel reservations during that time frame, just crossing my fingers and hoping that it would actually happen. But now, quote, NASA is developing a plan, an updated schedule to replace the engine controller while continuing integrated testing and reviewing launch opportunities in March and April. So we are pushed forward to spring because of this one issue. And who knows how many other things are going to rear their ugly heads as this process continues. Because keep in mind, we have yet to roll out the spacecraft, or rather the rocket, as we are seeing right here. That hasn't happened yet. And then the wet run, as it is called, where, as I said before, you fuel the rocket up and simulate a launch without actually having any ignition, and then detank the rocket afterwards. That's something that SpaceX does on a regular basis prior to launch. That's something that has not yet happened with SLS. Yes, they've tested their fuel tanks, but they haven't done a complete integrated wet run yet. Once they do that, who knows how many other issues are going to crop up. But here's what troubles me the most. I'm starting to see a pattern developing. With Starliner, Boeing is planning to swap out the service module rather than track down the root cause of what created the problems with all of these valves in the first place, and instead of determining what the root cause of the problem with their controller on engine number 4 with SLS is, they're simply swapping it out and pushing forward. I can understand that they're on a timeline, but will they actually determine what the problems were? What caused these issues? Or are they just going to swap it out with a new piece of equipment that might be just as faulty and pressing the button? This is not as big of a problem. We're talking about an unmanned vessel. However, if something goes seriously wrong with SLS, that could stop Artemis in its tracks. And if something goes seriously wrong with Starliner when it has 4 astronauts on board, that could create a disastrous situation for NASA, the likes of which we haven't seen since Columbia was destroyed and 7 astronauts lost at the beginning of this century. And speaking of patterns, SLS has been a budgetary and developmental nightmare for a very long time. The Office of Inspector General at NASA at the beginning of 2020 released a report that said, amongst other things, quote, NASA continues to struggle managing SLS program costs and schedule as the launch date for the first integrated SLS Orion mission slips further. Rising costs and delays can be attributed to challenges with program management, technical issues, and contractor performance. For example, the structure of the SLS contracts limits visibility into contract costs and prevents NASA from determining precise cost per element. Rather specifically, rather than using separate contract line item numbers, or CLIN, for each element's contract deliverables, each of the contracts have used a single CLIN to track all deliverables, making it difficult for the agency to determine if the contractor is meeting cost and schedule commitments for each deliverable. Moreover, as NASA and the contractors attempt to accelerate the production of SLS core stages to meet aggressive timelines, they must also address concerns about shortcomings in quality control. And this is just one paragraph in a damning report that indicates that SLS was deeply flawed way back in 2020, and the problems, frankly, were very widespread. Quote, each of the major element contracts for building the SLS for Artemis 1, stages, ICPS, boosters, and RS-25 engines have experienced technical challenges, performance issues, and requirement changes that collectively have resulted in $2 billion of cost overruns and increases and at least 2 years of schedule delays. And here is the most disturbing part of all. Both Northrop Grumman and Aerojet have experienced technical issues with problems related to the booster's propellant liner and insulation and development of RS-25's new engine controller unit, proving difficult to overcome. This is a conclusion that they had over 2 years ago, and yet this problem obviously has not been fully addressed, given that the controller unit is causing the delay right now. And even though I am not a fan of SLS in the least, I am becoming very concerned about its future, because right now it is the only human-rated rocket that stands a chance of taking astronauts to the moon, at least as far as the Western world is concerned. As I reported recently, the People's Republic of China are working on a rocket that may be able to take humans to the moon as early as 2026. I strongly doubt that Starship is going to be a human-rated vehicle by that time. SLS may be our only hope, at least in the short term, of getting astronauts back to the moon. And yet, look how deeply flawed this thing is. Look at the fact that we have a problem that was clearly identified 2 years ago and yet continues to have issues to this day. Is this going to be a successful test? Is there even a chance of a successful test given all the issues that existed not that long ago and seem to be persisting up to this point? I don't give it very good odds, to be honest. And launching sometime in spring would be an absolute miracle. And an even greater miracle would be the moment when Orion successfully splashes down in the ocean for a successful recovery. And this is something that is so completely opposed to the kind of feelings we had about Apollo, the kind of optimism that we had about going to the moon back in the 60s, something that seemed very doable, something that seemed very plausible, something that seemed inevitable given that we had the will and the expertise to do so. But today, NASA seems to be an old, tired, and outdated agency that is desperately trying to oversee an incompetent and corrupt contractor that is failing
failing at every turn to deliver on what it's promised to do. And the most important task that it's been given in half a century, returning the human species to the surface of the moon, seems as unlikely now as Starliner seems likely to succeed in the near future. And this gets me angrier than just about anything else. All we can do is hope that this engine controller issue is a fluke, an inconsistency, a once in 1,000 occurrence, and the rest of the issues that were addressed years ago have now been corrected. Let's hope that's the case, because the future of manned spaceflight and our return to the moon is in serious jeopardy. If you like what I have to say, if you enjoy this type of content and the type of message that I try to convey that few others on YouTube do, at least when it comes to spaceflight, you know how to support me. It's all in the description, and I could certainly use your support here at the close of the year. But have a good holiday season, and until we finally do return to the moon, in whatever shape or form that may ultimately take, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.